Hi, Caleb.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing?
Doing well?
I lied. I'm not doing well.
Why not?
There is a heat advisory in the area tonight, and it is extremely uncomfortable here. And as we mentioned in the last episode, you make me shut off my air conditioner, so it's very uncomfortable here right now.
We do it for the listeners, and I'm sure they will appreciate the decreased fan noise as a result.
We're suffering for our art.
We are. What are you drinking tonight?
Since the temperature is above 90 degrees, I made myself a gin and tonic, which is my official I need to cool off drink with the lovely Junipero gin from Anchor Distillery here in San Francisco.
All right.
Yeah, quite delightful. How about you?
I have a blood and sand tonight.
Oh, very nice. Very Scottish of you.
Yes, and I had some fresh oranges, so I decided to make it blood and sand.
Excellent. So this is a big week. We got a gift from the government.
We did. We got a new set of guidelines that had been hotly anticipated by the automotive industry and automotive fans of self-driving vehicles because the U.S. Department of Transportation released their Federal Automated Vehicles Policy, new guidelines that establish a framework for the safe, effective incorporation of automated vehicle technology.
That sounds very official.
It is. And basically, as more and more companies have been trying to introduce semi-autonomous or fully autonomous vehicles, they have really had to go to the National Highway Safety Transportation Administration, NHTSA, and also the U.S. Department of Transportation, which is the parent organization for NHTSA, to get clarification on certain guidelines and rules around what a driver is, getting permission to drive certain vehicles on public roads that are self-driving.
Yeah, because previously there really hadn't been any need to clarify what a driver is, right? Because it was always humans that were driving vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. The administration was created in the 1950s, 1960s, almost exactly 50 years ago. And obviously at that point in time, cars were really starting to boom in the U.S. The interstate highways were really kicking in, and they started mandating about safety and also just generally best practices for the automotive industry. And they're responsible for ensuring the safety of the traveling public, both in the air, the sky, sea, and land. And but you know, most things haven't been changing with the automotive world until very, very recently. And so a lot of the policymakers had been in states had been looking for guidance from the federal government, and the automotive industry and technology companies had been looking for more clarification around what would be legal, what would be illegal, what would the government want to see, so they'd have more sort of consistency in building plans to release fully autonomous vehicles. So this is the first step from the federal government to do it, and it's a over 160-page document, and it's quite a long read, but we got through a lot of it.
So previously, as you mentioned, it had been like a state-by-state thing, and I seem to recall reading that obviously California and I think Nevada were states that were pretty amenable to self-driving vehicles on the roads at the moment, and this is designed to standardize things across all states. Is that what you're saying?
It's intended to, it does have a section around imploring the states to follow guidelines that the federal government will lay out and create clear delineation between what the federal government will be responsible for and what states should be responsible for, so that states don't overstep and start licensing or mandating what technologies are in cars, which is actually supposed to be at the federal level. And also, even at the very local level, this announcement was actually made in Pittsburgh, and Uber has recently started doing some self-driving tests in Pittsburgh as well. And there was a big piece about the mayor of Pittsburgh being very pro innovation and pro self-driving vehicles. So it's even gotten to the local level of particular municipalities allowing self-driving cars on their streets. So the federal government really wanted to start getting involved and also make it clear their power to regulate these vehicles and ensure that they are safe, and make it clear that they will issue recalls if they feel they're unsafe or they are putting people at risk, undue risk.
All right, so let's, before we dive in, President Obama also wrote a op-ed this week in the Pittsburgh Gazette, timed with the release of this report.
Yes, so President Obama penned a piece about why he thinks that self-driving, fully automated cars are a good thing, touting a lot of the stats we've been talking about around decreased deaths, reduced accidents overall.
Definitely emphasizing the safety issue.
Yeah, very much about safety. Also then secondarily about increased access for mobility to folks who have disabilities or choose not to drive or don't have access to the resources to afford a car or personal transportation. And that he wants to see self-driving cars come out. I mean, he sort of talked about how when he started in office, he had to use a BlackBerry and had to have all these technologies that weren't even around when he started office 7.5 years ago. And just to sort of prove the point that this is moving very quickly and that he wants to make sure that his administration at least starts the charge before he leaves office on making sure self-driving cars become a reality in the near term. And I think that was one of the other overriding messages through this entire sort of choreographed announcement last week, was that the federal government is in support of fully self-driving cars. They are in support of the progression from where we are today to that point. And they want to work with automakers and technology companies and the public to ensure it happens as quickly and as safely as possible, and that they're trying to get out ahead of it, which is very different than their traditional posture towards new technologies like airbags, seatbelts, emergency braking, ABS, which typically were introduced by automakers first, and then only as sort of self-certified as safe. And then only after quite a while did the government get involved in regulating them, and then also eventually mandating that they become part of the federal safety standard for vehicles. So this is one of the first times they've actually come out ahead of a technology being mass adopted to try and actually sort of accelerate its advent, as well as ensure that it goes more to the way they want it to happen, especially since this is going to be a pretty big difference in terms of the technology advancement. They sort of equated it to the difference between a horse-drawn carriage, the horseless carriage, and then fully autonomous vehicles. So they see it as a third wave of ground transportation.
All right, so let's dive into this report then. What struck me in the first part, so the executive summary, which is usually the only part I would read in something like this.
You are an executive.
In this case, I did go a little deeper. But yeah, they really struck a few important points: safety, accessibility, and then finally, environmental impact. Maybe we can drill into that a little bit.
Yeah, so on the safety side, some stats they shared, which we have referenced, but now we're for 2015, that 35,092 people died in traffic crashes in the U.S. And a new stat, to me at least, was that 2.4 million people were injured. And that they claim 94% of those crashes are caused in some way by human choice or error. And I was mentioning that I thought the choice of the word choice was very unique, because a lot of times I think we think of these as accidents. They're called accidents. I know this is a bugaboo for you, but a lot of these crashes and deaths are actually choices by people to drink and drive, to be impaired in some other way, to not be rested.
Yeah, the choice happened earlier, right? It's not necessarily that you chose to do something reckless. Or that you chose to turn the wheel in a certain direction and cause the accident. It's that you made a choice earlier to impair yourself or drive at a uncontrollable rate of speed or something. So yeah, I think it sounded like they were doing kind of an umbrella term there for the human side of things.
Yeah, and they also avoid the word accident. They use the word crash, and I think they to play up the improvement to safety, you don't want to call these things accidents. It sort of has a no fault implication. When 94% of these are human error, the implication is that later on you can remove the human from the judgment, and a lot of these both deaths and injuries will go away. And that's one of the primary considerations for the Department of Transportation is to ensure the safety of people traveling. And so they feel it's their responsibility to accelerate the advent of these vehicles because it will actually increase safety in their view. So I think that was sort of bullet point number one of the executive summary.
Yeah, it's interesting in how it's almost laying a foundation to start a discussion around the fact that there are this many people dying every year in cars. I mean, because the number of people dying in automobile incidents has gone down over time as cars have gotten safer. Mostly, people are more likely to survive crashes that would have impaled or killed them in older vehicles with airbags and crumple zones and all of the technology around that.
Yep.
But I think there's a sort of out of sight, out of mind thing for most people where I doubt as many people would spend as much time in their vehicles if they were really concerned about it being as dangerous as it is. I think there's sort of a denialism, I guess, that collective cognitive dissonance sort of denial that goes on. And because, you need to be in your vehicle to get around. So I think it's pretty natural that you just kind of don't rationally calculate the dangers. And it feels like they're just starting to lay a foundation for that, to surface those numbers in the consciousness of people, where otherwise they would probably think that, this is the status quo. But
yeah,
I mean, it is the status quo, but the status quo is pretty awful. All you have to do is watch the local news on any given night, and there's accidents and people dying on highways, and it's sort of the carnage we know, I guess.
I mean, even to the point where it's so accepted that on Google Maps and Waze and things, you see there's an accident up ahead, and you think, at least for me, I'm thinking, oh, there's going to be a slowdown, and
right.
You don't even think about what that actually means.
Yeah, there might be a dead human being up there, or multiple human beings.
Yeah, and also that the one that struck me was the 2.4 million people injured. So even though cars are safer, being in a car crash or being hit by a car is still going to cause a ton of health-related issues, disabilities, and even on the very minor fender benders, loss of productivity and damage to your vehicles and cost to the insurance industry, and as a result, the consumers. So all of those are sort of the opportunity space. And I think once you actually have a path to making some substantive improvement there, then you can actually start talking about it. And I think that's sort of the point, is that the Department of Transportation now feels that they have some way to actually influence those numbers and bring them down further beyond where they are today. And that what a lot of these companies need is really clear guidance and support from the federal government to allow these technologies to be made possible. And because they are so broad and so wide-ranging in their implications to vehicles, that this is actually something within their power to help drive these numbers down from sort of a plateau of where they've been for the past decade. One of the other really interesting points in the intro was the statement that I thought was quite prescient and quite smart for them was, while a human driver may repeat the same mistake as millions before them, an HAV can benefit from the data and experience drawn from thousands of other vehicles on the road. So HAV is the term they're using for highly automated vehicle.
This report is sprinkled throughout with 3-letter acronyms.
I would say littered, but sprinkled is the kinder.
Yeah, littered might be better. All right, so we've got the haves and I guess we're implying we've got haves and have nots.
We do. Yes, that's good.
So a have is what they're calling the levels 3 to 5, right? From the 0 to 5 scale.
Yeah, on the SAE scale. And they've chosen to adopt that for their standards going forward as well. And so I think, the point here is just that they're recognizing that fleet learning and the actual vehicle's learning is going to be critically important, and that they're aware of that. And I mean, I think that just shows that they are actually quite cognizant of how this is going to work, and have been talking to manufacturers and folks like Tesla and others and Google, obviously, who are expounding the benefits of this and who talk about fleet learning in many of their public discussions. And to see that filter into the executive summary, I think is just good. And I think also just having read most of the document, I feel like overall, I haven't read too many government issued documents about policy frameworks, some accounting ones, but nothing on the automotive side. But overall, it seemed pretty sane, I have to say. If anyone's interested in reading it, we'll put it in the show notes. Essentially, it was quite direct and quite thoughtful. And I thought even some of the technology stuff was maybe slightly impractical, but at least they were being smart about it. And we'll get to some more of those.
Yeah, it was all stuff that made a lot of sense if you've been following this space at all. There was nothing that came out of left field, and there was nothing overly prescriptive or specific, where it felt like it was more general guidelines and all things that would probably fall into common sense, I guess, for people in the space.
Yeah, so the 4 key things that they said were the motivating factors. We've touched on a few of them, but just to be complete: safety, so helping the vast majority of car crashes that result from human error or judgment, saving those thousands of lives; mobility, transforming personal mobility for millions of Americans; productivity, reducing the cost of transportation for families, businesses, communities; and sustainability, which was last, of improving the efficiency of vehicles and reducing road congestion. And then very far at the end of that statement saying that this might also accelerate electrification. So not hinging autonomy with electrification, but detaching it and creating the sort of framework for it to be independent of electrification, not making a value judgment about them being linked, where obviously we, following Tesla, they are inextricably linked for Tesla, but for many automakers, they won't be.
Yeah.
So one of the other things they talked about in the early sections was how to prepare the public for these transformations was saying that new vehicle technologies that were developed in the 20th century, such as seatbelts and airbags, child seats, were once controversial at their introduction. But after having saved hundreds of thousands of lives, they're now considered indispensable, in their words. And that these advanced technologies from automatic emergency braking and lane departure are already making their way into vehicles. And they sort of pose the question to the reader of how many more lives might be saved today and in the future with highly automated vehicles. And the Department of Transportation is committed to finding out. So they sort of end their opening statements with that point of, it may be scary, there may be problems, there may be some issues, but we are determined to figuring this out and doing it in an open way and in a way that doesn't stymie innovation. I think that the phrase innovation, advancement, technology, all these sort of safety were the sort of buzzwords if you had to reduce down what the president was talking about and the Department of Transportation's team was talking about. They definitely seem on message around this being good overall and not being a scary thing that the government's now coming in to crack down on.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, people who aren't necessarily keeping up with this sort of stuff and people who aren't even necessarily keeping up with the advances in technology, the idea of computers taking over your car might be kind of terrifying if your only experience with computers is the buggy, virus-ridden Dell laptop running Windows that you need to use Facebook or whatever. That thinking about that being in control of your life as you drive down the highway is probably terrifying.
Yeah, and I think they also wanted to make it clear that the government is watching out and going to be monitoring this so that you can know that it isn't completely the Wild West out there, that it isn't just these companies doing whatever they want, that we are watching and we are involved and we're working with these companies to make sure this is safe. Because I think a lot of, like you mentioned, a lot of people see these as science projects and they hear about the Google cars and the Uber self-driving and they're these small tests and it's not clear when they're actually coming out for real. You hear big companies like Ford talking about 2020, 2021, and it's still this sort of futuristic thing, and that's a little scary.
Yeah, well, we're not that far from the what was it, ARPA's desert run where they had I think at some point it took the first year no car could even finish, and then at some point I think the Stanford team had a VW Touareg that managed to make it through. But yeah, things are moving really quickly.
Absolutely. One of the other things I thought was important, and some of the media coverage of this didn't quite capture, was that these are not laws. So we're going to describe some of the things that the Department of Transportation recommends, but these are guidelines. And so from a legal framework, these are pre-law. This is what they hope companies conform with in advance of needing to actually create regulation. And one of the things in doing research about the NHTSA and the Department of Transportation and the relationship with automakers is that even to the point of a lot of safety features, many cars just have to self-certify that they meet the standards for having airbags and brakes and all the standard features. And only if they're found to be not in compliance with the safety standards will they have to issue a recall or get in sort of legal problems with the federal government.
Oh, is this related to crash tests too, or is that something different?
It is that you need to be safe enough to meet certain standards, but they don't test every car before it ships. And so it's possible that a vehicle would be unsafe and found out after the fact. And so just sort of to remind people that at this part of the federal government, which has a budget of only around $800 million for the NHTSA, which is actually responsible for all this, and that's sort of in comparison with the EPA, which is $8 billion a year, the FDA, which is $4 billion, and the DEA, which is $2 billion. So it's one of the smallest sort of enforcement agencies for public safety at $800 million, so under $1 billion. That this is one of the first times they're really sort of going out in advance of the technology being out there, and that these are guidelines because they hope not to actually have to create many laws. They would prefer that companies self-regulate and create safe policies and safe cars and good software, and that states introduce very open laws that will encourage vehicles to be able to move across states without having issues with local patrolmen and women.
Right, you got interstate commerce going on there.
Right, exactly. We don't want the big trucks to have to put new sensors on when they cross over state boundaries. So they're kind of trying to get out there, but not create laws in advance of actually understanding what's going to happen here. So I think that was also pretty reasonable, and a lot of the automakers who did make public comment were not rallying against this proposed guidelines. It seemed relatively tame and well received. So we'll go through some of the details of it now, but I think that's also an important component here, is that there aren't actually any new laws. This is all voluntary compliance with these concepts and more illustrative of their thinking than forced regulation. So folks who are libertarian or quite right-leaning, there are no new laws yet. These are just guidelines.
Right. It kind of reminds me of a story about government websites in South Korea where they mandated back in the late 90s, I believe, and I might be screwing this up because I'm digging deep in my brain for this, but they had something where they mandated Internet Explorer as the tool for getting access to government websites. They had some sort of ActiveX control that was used everywhere, and because they codified that into law, it's this weird thing where now you have, I don't know if it's still like this, but a few years ago when I was reading this, they still had this problem where you had to support Internet Explorer and this weird ActiveX control to access certain government features because it was the law.
Right, exactly. They don't want to get into a place where they mandate you have to have some certain type of radar or some certain type of LiDAR or have a computer of a certain amount of processing power and then create a really weird, perverted system where all these auto manufacturers are creating these strange systems.
Right, because the law is going to move way slower than any technology.
Exactly, and they recognize that, and they stated that multiple times, that they don't think they're going to be able to keep up. And so their approach is actually to sort of indicate the outcomes they want to have happen, and then let the individual companies figure out how their cars and trucks will meet those certain outcomes, and they will judge the outcomes and the decision-making processes with which they claim those outcomes are met, but not regulate how it's done.
So basically it's a driving test for robots.
Yeah, it's sort of a driving test for robots, and then it's also a decision-making test for the people who are implementing them. So they have to describe in pretty clear detail how they made many of these decisions, so that when something goes wrong and the government is concerned, they can go to these companies with these sort of signed documents that they submitted to understand why what they said it did isn't actually what happened. So they don't necessarily need to understand how it works, but they just need to understand what happened. So that's their theory. One of the components of this was the guidelines for the performance of the vehicles, a model state policy for how states should deal with it, and then the NHTSA's current regulatory tools to talk about how they currently can influence self-driving vehicles and deal with recalls and such. And then also finally ending with a section around the new tools and authorities they may need in the future that their current congressionally appointed rights do not cover. But in this episode, I'm most interested in talking about the actual vehicle performance guidance for automated vehicles, since it's sort of this 15-point checklist that's been floating around in a lot of the news articles. But I haven't heard too many people go into detail about what the heck was mentioned. So that's what we want to spend the majority of the time talking about.
Yeah, the checklist is very interesting, especially since we've covered a couple of these in episodes already too. So, pat ourselves on the back and let's dive into this checklist.
All right. So we'll go through all 15 real rapid fire.
Let's do a lightning round.
A lightning round?
Yeah, sure. So what are the 15 and then maybe we can kind of pick a few out that we want to drill in on.
Okay, so these are the 15 that are supposed to be described back to NHTSA from each manufacturer for each highly automated vehicle HAV that they are working on. Okay, so here we go. Number 1, operational design domain. This means how and where the HAV is supposed to function and operate. So basically, where and what for this level of autonomy does it work? Does it work at night? Does it work in cities only? Does it work in rural areas? What are you claiming that this level of autonomy will do, and how does it do it? That's number 1.
So this means you can divide companies like Otto, which was bought by Uber, which is doing mostly interstate trucking, versus maybe like some of the taxi bus type vehicles that might only work in denser environments where you could have niche vehicles.
Yep, niche vehicles, niche applications, and basically cover your butt in terms of what you're saying your part of this system is going to do. And because they realize it's not going to be level 5, the car doing everything in every circumstance perfectly, they are creating a way for manufacturers to allow, for instance, saying, we're going to avoid hitting deer. And that will be like, we're going to avoid hitting animals in like emergency braking situations. And that'll be one of our automated systems. And then we're going to have a self-driving lane keeping and like highway driving environment. But we make no claims about city driving. And so we won't let the car drive in the city. So they want to know where the vehicle is autonomous and where it isn't. So that's number 1.
Okay, sorry, I got us off lightning round here. Let's continue going through them, and I will not interrupt you like I just did with number 1. So
no, that's okay. I'm sure that's what you were thinking and feeling. Let it flow. Number 2, object and event detection and response. So this is the ability to perceive and respond to the real world that the HAV system has to understand. Number 3 is fallback. So what happens when the system has a failure of some sort? How does it respond to that? Number 4 is a validation method. So how do you as a company making this test validate and verify that the HAV system does what you say it does and ensure that it's safe? Number 5 is registration and certification. So this is basically you need to register and certify to NHTSA that the HAV system exists and that you're going to deploy it. Number 6 is data recording and sharing. What data does the HAV record, and is there the capability for crash reconstruction and reporting of the any sort of safety benefits? Number 7 is the post-crash behavior. So what happens if your car gets hit and sensors are damaged? How does the car respond? What happens if the car can't drive itself anymore? You need to have ways to cope with that. Number 8 is privacy. These cars have way more data. They're usually connected to the internet. How are you protecting the privacy of the consumer or occupants of the vehicle from their personal information? Number 9 is system safety. How are you engineering the safety practices? Number 10 is vehicle cybersecurity. Approaches to guard against vehicle hacking risks.
Hallelujah.
Number 11 is human-machine interface. So how do you communicate with the driver, other occupants, and other road users, which might be pedestrians, cyclists, other drivers? Number 12 is crashworthiness, so ensuring the protection of the occupants in crashing situations. Number 13 is consumer education and training. How are you educating and training users and the public of your HAV's capabilities? Number 14, the penultimate, ethical considerations. How are your vehicles programmed to address conflicts? Number 15, federal, state, local laws. How are these vehicles programmed to comply with all the applicable traffic laws? So that is all 15.
Wow, take a breath. You've earned it.
All right, breath.
So let's maybe we can dive into some of the ones that are interesting. I mean, I think some of them, like crashworthiness, are pretty self-explanatory. Registration and certification, obviously, yes, that makes sense. So yeah, maybe we can drill into some of them that, I mean, personally, the ones I think are really interesting are data recording and sharing and privacy kind of go hand in hand. Those are pretty interesting. Vehicle cybersecurity, number 10, is extremely interesting. Number 11, human-machine interface, I thought was really interesting because it also introduces this idea of communicating with the outside world and not just the person in the vehicle. And then, of course, I just want to pat ourselves on the back for ethical considerations as a official bullet point. And we did do a whole episode on the ethical considerations of autonomous vehicles. Although then I was just reading something recently in I think this month's edition of Nautilus magazine, which is a great kind of pop science magazine. If you don't read it, you should. It has a lot of interesting stuff in it. And they had a pretty interesting article this edition about how we don't necessarily know how these deep learning neural networks are working, that essentially people are having to reverse engineer how they think these systems are working. So you've got these neural networks that are really good at recognizing faces, but we don't necessarily know exactly, I mean, we know how they're set up, but we don't know exactly how they're doing what they're doing. And there is a trade-off between the more effective the methods are, the less understandable they are. So anyways, that is fresh in my mind and was kind of interesting there, where we could end up with something where we don't actually know why it makes the decisions it makes.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the really big blind spots in this document, because a lot of what they're talking about when you read each individual section is the company outlining how they designed the system, how they tested it, how they verified that it was crashworthy or that the cybersecurity system is sound, using air quotes best industry practices for all of these things. And then having a way that in the event of some sort of incident, being able to reverse engineer and prove back how the decision was made. And in the situation where there are neural networks involved, it's sort of like asking someone, why did you swerve left instead of right? It's sort of a
right.
It's up to interpretation. These are not deterministic systems that you can look back in the code and sort of follow the logic tree of what happened. And especially in the ethical one, they talked about, well, there's branching logic that might lead you to make one decision or another. And ultimately, some of these systems they may be more artificial intelligence inspired, neural network inspired, and the makers of them could not predict in advance what would happen. And even after getting the result, they couldn't necessarily guarantee that the same outcome would happen again, given slightly different stimulus. And I think that was what Elon was talking about on the last call, was like, there is no perfect safety, and they can't even guarantee that with the new software update that the crash in Florida wouldn't happen again, because they can't know for sure what if all those conditions were exactly the same, what would have happened. And I think that scares the poop out of these regulators, because they're not used to that. They want someone to tell them this is why and this is what would have happened.
Nice. And you avoided us having to use a sensor horn right there.
As long as poop is okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I'm not supposed to say interesting either. All my verbal tics are coming out here. It is a challenge that we might not necessarily be able to describe. I mean, there's the idea of what's called an expert system, where it's essentially this giant logic tree of, if this is the case, then do this. If this, then do this. And that was where AI was 30 years ago, and ended up not being a fruitful avenue for most things. And a lot of the applications that you're seeing nowadays are more, I guess, biological based, where all these like neural networks and deep learning, and it's a lot less understandable as to what's going on. But it's also, you could get into a situation too where you might as you have like a fleet learning model going on, and this almost like entity that's learning and sort of evolving its ability to drive, maybe as certain branches of this evolutionary tree make mistakes, you might need some ability to roll back certain branches of evolution, I guess, and then sort of force a species, I guess, to go extinct, if we're kind of blurring the digital and the biological here, where you could imagine something like that, where you might not necessarily know why, but you need to sort of kill a line of cars, I guess, that aren't performing well, and bring them, reboot them as a different species.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the concept that depending, like if they don't have a full sensor suite, the same way that a child may learn a behavior that they later need to unlearn because they didn't have the capabilities to deal with that concept, right? Like maybe you say certain things at home that you're not supposed to say out in public. That sort of requires another level of understanding that that's okay in certain circumstances and not in others. And so the idea that these cars may behave differently in different environments, and then actually need either new training data or new sensors or just sort of new programming models to understand how to not behave the exact same way going around a turn off of an exit versus going around a turn of the same arc on flat sort of roads on exiting a highway. You're going to do it a little bit differently than you might on surface streets near a school or something, even though the parameters of that road are the same. So yeah, I think that's definitely real. And I think one of the other things that stood out to me that I hadn't seen clear description of before, sort of jumping back to sort of the very top of these 15 guidelines, was that they stated clearly, under current law, manufacturers bear the responsibility to self-certify all the vehicles they manufacture for use on public roadways, comply with applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards. Secondly, therefore, if a vehicle is compliant within the existing FMVSS regulatory framework and maintains a conventional vehicle design, there is currently no specific federal legal barrier to an HAV being offered for sale. So they're saying there is no limit currently, as long as the car has a traditional design, which basically means that it has a forward-facing driver's seat, brake pedals, turn signals, all the standard components of a car. There's nothing that's stopping a level 5 car from being sold. So that's super interesting to me. And that all these subsequent 15 guidelines are to ensure that that vehicle won't be recalled for being unsafe. But there's nothing stopping someone from selling that. So I thought that was really a powerful, it's not an admission, it's just a statement of policy that I hadn't heard, actually. I didn't know that would actually be possible. So I thought that was really, really cool.
It's a statement of pre-policy, I guess. Or no policy, but pre-law.
It is policy.
Yeah, pre-law.
Policy, pre-law, right. They don't think there's any reason in the current law that would prevent that from happening. No new laws need to be created to allow it to be offered for sale. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they're going into the self-reporting, I guess, for now, which seems like the lightest weight way to go about it.
Yeah, so they expect every company that's selling a level 3 or higher to submit a safety assessment within 4 months of the vehicle being tested or made available for sale, and that every time there's a major change to the software or hardware of that vehicle, they expect a new report to be submitted with the changes and what's different. So basically, there will be on the web somewhere a listing of all the cars that are being tested with all of their current capabilities publicly available. So that'll be kind of fun to go through. Yeah,
it was pretty adamant about making sure that all this stuff was public, and I guess building up the public trust by being as transparent as possible with the results. And then, so you mentioned demonstrating the competence, I guess, of the vehicles. Is there is there a not a checklist, but is there some sort of definition as to what driving tests that these vehicles need to be able to do?
Yes, there is. So they've talked about this idea of sort of normal, the cars need to be able to drive normally. And
well, hopefully drive well, not necessarily normal, but yeah.
Yeah, hopefully better. So because these cars are going to need to interact with other human drivers, they need to not only perform the written law of how cars are supposed to abide, but the standard driving books and for federal law as well as local and state don't actually describe all the things you need to do as a driver. So some of the ones I thought were particularly interesting, being able to perform a highway speed merge. So example they gave was a freeway. So if you want your car to be fully self-driving and sort of pass the standards, it'll need to be able to do that, which isn't unusual, but is good to see that outlined. Another one was detect passing and no passing zones and perform passing maneuvers. So if you get stuck behind a really slow truck, your car needs to be able to pass. And one of the other ones that was kind of cool was navigate roundabouts. So that would do better than most Americans. Navigate a parking lot and locate spaces. Follow police, first responders controlling a traffic intersection. Also being able to respond to citizens directing traffic after a crash. So after a crash, sometimes people will get out and try and drive, help deal with the scene and stop people from getting in a pileup. So your car needs to be able to deal with that. Yielding to pedestrians. So there are like 20 or 30 different, it basically is a mini checklist of if you're designing a self-driving car, basically the spec in software terms of what the car should be able to do, and provides a really clear understanding of like, okay, if I'm buying a car and I think it's self-driving, how many of these things can it actually do? And that auto manufacturers will probably be describing which of these they can actually perform and under what circumstances. So it was really clear.
It reads pretty much like what you'd expect to be on the clipboard of the driving instructor who's sitting in the passenger seat when you're trying to get your driver's license.
Right, exactly. One of the other components I thought was pretty important was this idea that all these guidelines are talking about the level 3, 4, and 5, because in those situations, the car has to both actually execute the driving mechanisms, but also be aware of its surroundings. And in level 0, 1, and 2, the human driver is always fully in the loop. But one of the things I talked about towards the end was this very specific call out towards level 2 complacency. And I can't help but believe this is part of a response to some of the challenges around the Tesla autopilot. And their direct quote here was that manufacturers and other entities should assume that the technical distinction between the levels of automation between level 2 and 3 may not be clear to all users or the general public, and systems expectations of the drivers and those drivers' actual understanding of the critical importance of their supervisory role may be materially different. And I think this really hits on the tension between people who are critics of autopilot and Tesla's continued sort of trying to make it more clear to drivers that they need to be fully involved, even when it sometimes feels like they don't need to be.
Right.
And this is them really trying to make it clear to the automakers and I guess just everyone in the supply chain that the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration believes it is their responsibility, as in the manufacturers, to ensure that people understand. And if they don't, they see that as a failure of the design of the system. So I think it's sort of an early warning that people need to be quite aware of this. Otherwise, they will get more involved.
Yeah, it's a difficult tension too, because you want to sell the people who are buying these vehicles on these features, but inherent in any sales pitch is a little bit of overpromising, right? Or at least selling the best case scenario.
Yeah, and I think it didn't get mentioned, but I think the other agency that might get involved would be the FTC for false advertising claims or over advertising. And Mercedes had an issue where they had some ads that said self-driving in them, and they had to recant them because they had some people claim that was not true, and got slammed with some false advertising potential claims. So they decided to pull them. But I think autopilot certainly walks a very fine line. I think in the letter of the law, I think it's correct. But certainly in the spirit of the law for many consumers, they think it is a self-driving car. And I think NHTSA and the Department of Transportation wants to make it very clear to these automakers that is not going to be acceptable to them, and that they are watching out for folks who are overpromising in the capabilities.
Maybe we'll get to level 3 before they have a chance to really clamp down on that.
Hopefully.
I thought the other thing that was interesting was this idea of a human-machine interface, which makes a lot of sense, talking about, as the occupant of the vehicle, trying to notify you when you need to take over, notifying you of what the vehicle is doing. All that makes a lot of sense. What is pretty new about this is the idea of communicating to people outside of the vehicle. Mm-hmm. And I guess there's a sort of a binary way right now of communicating outside the vehicle, where you have a horn. I guess maybe it's not quite binary, because you can do like a friendly horn versus a angry horn. So maybe it's like a 2-bit interface.
Well, and you have more. I mean, you have the motion of the car, right? There's the creeping aspect, and then there's also looking at the driver. So we actually have a lot. And if that windscreen was completely blacked out, I think it would be quite difficult to, as a pedestrian navigating around, to ensure your safety. And so in what they called out here was that these cars may need to be able to actually communicate with pedestrians and other vehicles through some sort of new interface. And they didn't dictate what interface that needs to be. But we've seen some experiments around I think Mercedes, the super crazy Mercedes, would project lights onto the ground with like crossing signs or stop signs that make pedestrians behave.
Yeah, there's one that has I think a startup in Mountain View maybe, that has a screen that they put on top of the vehicle, and it's displaying either like an emoticon kind of face, or like just actual messaging saying like, I'm not moving, or safe to cross, or something like that. But then you mentioned right before we started recording, you mentioned too the sort of other direction of this, which is pretty interesting, where cars might have to be able to hear sirens, or maybe if you just noticed there was a train going through right as I was talking earlier, and then a train horn or something that as a human driver you would notice. But none of these autonomous vehicles, I think you mentioned, don't have any sort of audio microphones as input.
Yeah, and then one of the other ones that they were talking about was that these vehicles, especially since they're going to be accommodating more folks with disabilities, also need to make sure that their interfaces, currently all cars have the assumption that everyone who's using them as drivers are sighted, because you can't be licensed if you're not sighted. But now you may have folks who are low sight or blind, and need to have haptics or more tactile controls, and so that was really fascinating, as well as folks who are deaf, and so just car manufacturers and designers needing to consider a broader set of accessibility for these vehicles, where typically that's not been part of the design considerations, because those haven't been consumers of theirs. I thought that was really intriguing, especially in the failure cases, because they were talking about if that car isn't able to get from point A to point B and actually has a malfunction, that it needs to be able to communicate that to the occupant and also safely navigate away. And then it's possible that the occupant actually is drunk, is unable to drive, is too young to drive, never has had a license. Right. And so you can't rely on them being able to drive to take over in all cases. So that was a really interesting one, where it's like, well, I have a self-driving car. I don't have a license anymore, and I'm drunk, but the car still has a steering wheel, and I'm sitting in the driver's seat, but I'm not driving, but I need to take over.
I wonder if that opens up the ability for some sort of remote driving service too. Like maybe the AAA of the future would be a service where someone could just take over and remotely pilot you to where you need to go.
They mentioned something like that. They mentioned that for the vehicles that are not going to have any humans inside, like delivery trucks and things like that, that the remote operators need to be able to understand what's going on with the fleet and deal with incidents if the vehicle itself can't. So I think that there's a lot of interesting scenarios that they are already contemplating, and that gave me actually a good amount of confidence that they are thinking about these issues, and they've consulted with a lot of folks to create these guidelines. It's not a purely mechanical sort of guidelines. It definitely has more broader implications and sort of concepts illustrated, and it really just challenges the folks who are working on these systems to have thoughts about this and answers for this, and then they have to describe their solutions. And so I think reading these submissions will be really fascinating if you're into this, because you're going to hear what Ford and what Chrysler and GM and Tesla and Google have to say about all of these 15 bullet points in each of their vehicles and how they deal with it. So I think we're going to get a whole new level of transparency, because I think the auto manufacturers are going to comply, because their worst nightmare is for there to be more laws introduced that stop them from doing this. And I think they're going to want to self-comply and show how good they're being and how much they're contributing, because they know there will be accidents. And so they need to make sure that the Department of Transportation and NHTSA are going to wholeheartedly say, this car company has submitted everything we've ever asked for voluntarily. They have great engineers. They have all this documentation. We've been looking at it for years, and it's unfortunate this accident has happened, but we're not going to let it stop us, because they've been doing everything we want and they're a model citizen.
Right.
And I don't think any one of these manufacturers wants to be on the side of, this company never turned in their homework, and we're going to go make an example of them because they haven't been following our guidelines. So,
or worse yet, you have to take their word that they're doing everything.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be, in Tesla's particular case, they've also said they're trying to figure out how to do this in a way that allows companies to still be competitive, because they don't want to have to share trade secrets. So I think that might be a place where people push back on. One of the tenets was data sharing, and I just can't foresee many of the automakers wanting to share this data publicly for other automakers. So that Tesla's competitors can get as good as they are by sharing their data. I just don't see that happening. I think that the fleet learning is going to be a competitive advantage. And so as much as the Department of Transportation would like all the automakers to share the data so they all advance faster, I think the business realities aren't going to allow that. So I think that will change.
I wonder if they would get into you could imagine a scenario where the ability to navigate and drive is proprietary, but the mapping might be something that is shared, I guess. Like, why would a new company have to map the entire country? That's a little bit weird.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that so much money is being spent on mapping because they see it as a defensible asset. It's hard, and so it's valuable. I think if anything, crash data will be shared because they're rare, and no car company wants to have crashes happen, regardless of who's sold that car. So I think, and also because there will be public investigations, it makes sense to be in front of that.
There was no mention of anything like a black box. I was expecting to see some sort of like aviation black box requirement. I mean, I guess you could infer it from some of these.
It was in the data recording section.
Okay.
Because they have a section for, like, you need to be able to reconstruct a crash. So for crash reconstruction purposes, including during testing, the data should be stored, maintained, and readily available for retrieval by the entity itself and by NHTSA. So they're imploring all of the car companies to store all the data from the sensors somewhere, and hopefully on the cloud, so that it can actually be reconstructed, which we believe Tesla has been doing a pretty good job of. And then also, the vehicle should record at a minimum all information relevant to the event and the performance of the system, so that the circumstances of the event can be reconstructed. This data should also contain information relating to the status of the HAV system and if the HAV system or human driver was in control of the vehicle at the time. I mean, they're being pretty prescriptive here around, you need to store all of this data that you have, and it needs to be in a format that not only you can use, but NHTSA can use. And we also want you to store all the positive outcomes as well. So they're also saying you should also store when your automatic braking system saves the day, or when your automatic lane departure stops someone from drifting into another car, or when your automatic avoidance of a crash saves someone, because they also want to tout the positive ones. So they're encouraging folks to record and save all this.
Filtered for privacy, though, of course.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And it said filtered for privacy. But that doesn't make any sense, because if you get into an accident, they know. I mean, I just don't understand how they're going to square that concept that they know which particular vehicle it was, and how can they not know who the. I mean,
well, I think you don't want to necessarily say that your car was you prevented a fender bender in the parking lot of a strip club or something. You know, like that would be something that you might not want being public.
Yeah, certainly. I guess it remains to be seen how that is actually executed, because we've seen many cases where even Google Wi-Fi and location mapping stuff that is anonymized is not actually anonymous. So I don't have high hopes for certain car companies being able to actually anonymize data well.
And it could be material too, right? If it's the like neon girly sign that actually caused the confusion for the sensors, then maybe you have to disclose that.
Yeah,
but I guess you don't have to disclose the owner of the vehicle.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to necessarily disclose that. I'm just saying that it is still known. It's still there's still many factors that are identifying, right? If it's a particular Model S of a certain size, like certain color, and that's not identifying, but the fact that that's the only one in your neighborhood in this strip club, like it's pretty obvious to tell who you are, right? If you're the only person in your town with that kind of car. So I think that's sort of the unintended consequences of de-anonymizing things, is that enough anonymous data points can make someone not anonymous. But anyways, we're getting a little off topic. Was there anything else from the document that in closing you wanted to call out or thought was particularly important?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that was pretty good for now. We're way over our time limit, so maybe we can digest this for a week and come back to it if we have some more stuff.
Yeah.
Unless did you have something off the top of your head that you wanted to throw out here?
I think that after reading quite a lot of this document, and there's still more to go, I was pleasantly impressed with the thoughtfulness and the comprehensiveness of the document. I think that this is actually a positive step forward. I think the fact that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Department of Transportation more broadly, as well as the Obama administration, are supporting self-driving vehicles and automated vehicles in all of their forms is really a positive sign. I think it's all too easy for any large organization to try to slow down progress and technological progress, especially when things can be dangerous. And I think it's really fascinating that most of the criticism has been around safety, and yet the primary motivation for building this technology is safety. Is such a fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
Because in the progress of making things more safe, we inherently are going to cause people to die. And yet it is most likely true that these are already saving lives and helping avoid accidents. And so the rare cases when things do go wrong will be amplified because they will be in self-driving. And yet fundamentally this is on the right path. And I think it's a good sign that the government, who is tasked with following up with and issuing and protecting the general safety, they seem to understand that that's a dichotomy that they have to accept to make this progress. And I think that's really positive for the progress of this. So I'm encouraged that this could have gone the other way. The negative press around the Tesla incidents could have caused a more conservative approach to a zero tolerance policy for any accidents with self-driving vehicles, even though that's empirically impossible. And so I think this is a good progression, and I'm excited to see the public discussion over the next 60 days and what the future updates hold, and especially what the vehicle makers actually submit and what their responses over the next few months are, because that will be quite telling if they take this seriously or if they think this is they're going to ignore it until it actually is law.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that happening. It seems like I would expect responses from everyone involved here. And yeah, I would say the most striking thing for me in reading it was that nothing really seemed outrageous, which is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
It all seemed inherently reasonable, and it seems like just good common sense.
And that is not common with government created documents. So I think that's a good way to end. So if anyone has any more comments or thoughts about this, they can leave a comment on our website, theteslashow.com. You can also talk to us on Twitter at The Tesla Show, and find us on our subreddit on Reddit at r/The Tesla Show.
And if you are a government employee involved with any of this stuff, feel free to reach out and we will give you full whistleblower protection.
I cannot claim that, but we could put you on the show.
I'm not even sure what it means, so maybe.
And we could use voice modulation if you'd like.
Oh, that would be pretty cool. Can we do that?
I'm sure we can. GarageBand has that.
All right. We're in there then. All right.
All right. Well, with that, I'll talk to you later, Mike, and turn on that AC again.
Yes, it's going on right now. All right. See you later.